You have to speak very clearly.
Okay, it's 5 minutes after that seems like the right time to begin. Welcome. My name is Richard Grusin. I direct the Center for 21st Century Studies. We're sponsoring Nick's talk, invited him here today. Before I introduce him, let me remind you or inform those of you who don't know that after the talk, we'll have a reception up on the 9th floor of Curtin Hall where you can talk informally with each other and with Nick. And it's worth the view, and it's a beautiful day. And if you haven't seen the view from the 9th floor, you should just come up for that, if for nothing else. It's really a pleasure to have Nick Mirzoeff here. It feels like I've known Nick for a long time, and yet this visit is actually the first time we've had the opportunity to spend an extended period together, sitting down talking last night and then this afternoon for coffee. And there's a couple of reasons, I guess, why I have that feeling. So one is that I've known his work, and especially the really canonical work on visual culture from 1999 that is still taught widely across universities, across both sides of the pond, and even maybe down south in the other half of the globe. And Nick was a speaker here at our After Extinction conference in 2015 and participated in that as well. But Nick's career trajectory is also familiar in a sense to me, partly in a way that I recognize a bit of my career trajectory, but also some of my colleagues, I think, have similar trajectories. So Nick started out as doing work that was more, I wouldn't say formal, but let's say more aesthetic in nature, and especially over the course of the 21st century has become increasingly and explicitly political and activist in its aims. And it seems that for many of us, it's just been impossible, certainly first beginning after 2001, and not the bombing itself, but the huge overreaction to that by the U.S. securitization machine. And then for those of us in Wisconsin after 2010, it's been impossible not, I think, to be politically engaged and politically active and to have that impact your work. And so Nick's work has taken that trajectory. I feel, I recognize that trajectory. His work he's gone way further than I have, and I wish I had. I admire tremendously his engagement in activist issues around decolonization in particular, but race studies and so forth. And it's a familiar and really valuable trajectory. Nick's a professor at NYU in visual culture, really was one of the people who helped put visual culture studies on the map. But now he's really also helping to put things like tearing down the monuments and decolonizing museums on the map as well. There's another reason that Nick feels like I've known him for a while and seems kind of familiar, is that in some ways Nick and I are doppelgangers, at least according to, at a certain time, Facebook's facial recognition algorithms. Because there was a period, and I think it hasn't happened in a while, so I think Facebook has kind of gotten better at facial recognition, but there was a period of, I'd say at least a year, where a photo of Nick would go up or a photo of me would go up, and Facebook would ask me on my photo, do you want to tag Nick Mirzoeff? And Nick's photo would go up, and Facebook would say, do you want to tag Richard Grusin? And we're both Jewish, and we're both academics, and we have glasses, but, there's not a lot of, we have our distinctive looks, but not to Facebook's algorithm. So this was really we had some fun with that for a while. So Nick really does, it really is a sense of, I think, I have a sense of familiarity that, that's more than how much time we spent together, and I think you'll all have that sense after listening to Nick talk today. Last thing I'll say is the title of his talk is Whiteness and the Crisis, but I was actually wondering if that wasn't a typo, because I thought that whiteness is the crisis, but I imagine he'll be talking about that as he goes on. So I'm going to let him explain that with really tremendous joy. I want to welcome Nick Mirzoeff.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out on a lovely Friday afternoon. Can you hear me in the back? If you can't, there are lots of lovely seats in the front, and I'm not actually infectious at the moment, so anybody do feel free to come down. It's a great pleasure to be back in Wisconsin. It's a place that has actually had a significant role in my life. I taught here in Madison for a number of years. My daughter is a UW graduate, and this is, as Richard said, I've been here in Milwaukee on a number of occasions. And this is a moment, is it not? I mean, we are in an extraordinary cultural, political, historical moment, as Richard has just said, and we're all, I'm sure, very much aware. So this work that I'm doing now is an unfolding series of work, and I'm going to talk about that has slowly become clearer to me that it is a relationship between whiteness and the crisis, whiteness as the crisis, whiteness is the crisis. The title, to explain, given that Richard did ask that, is a homage to Stuart Hall and the idea of policing the crisis back in the day. And I'll say more about that. But I wanted to begin by saying that one of the reasons to say this right now is that in the course of really the last week or so, it's become very clear, even to those of us that maybe don't always spend much time thinking about how white supremacy thinks of itself, that it is cohering around a transnational set of ideas that are reprising past theories of whiteness, but in the realm of the digital and in the realm of the transnational, around this idea of replacement. And this is a eugenics idea that has come back into contemporary circulation. We saw it most obviously, of course, in Christchurch with the killing there by that shooter who killed about 50 people and published a manifesto under that title, The Great Replacement. We also saw it again in Charlottesville last week, and this didn't make as much news, but you may have seen that the high school in Charlottesville was on lockdown last week because of an amply documented threat of a shooter who intended to target minorities in that high school and was arrested, 17-year-old white boy. So we are in a dynamic moment, and it's one that has both a short history, which I'll outline at the beginning, and then a very long history, which I'll also outline, and think about some ways in which we might take some steps to address this issue nationally and then within the university. So the picture I'm showing you above my head, some of you may recognize, comes from 2014. It was called the Millions March. It was part of Black Lives Matter, and that's University Place in New York City. And in the front of the march here is this banner that represents the eyes of Eric Garner, who was killed by New York City police in August of 2014, famously saying, "I can't breathe." And this march went around New York City to the sites of police violence, and people who completed the entire march walked 19 miles. And at that time, it seems like a long time ago now, I suppose it is, 5 years, but there seemed to be a genuine double power emerging in the United States. And only a week or so later, a person came to New York City from Baltimore and killed 2 police. And in that action, the balance shifted. And Mayor de Blasio was challenged by New York City police. Black Lives Matter itself was challenged. And of course, then we moved into the era that saw the rise of Donald Trump. Worldwide, though, soon after that shift away from Black Lives Matter in the United States, the Votes Must Fall movement began in South Africa, reprising earlier decolonial moves against statues that had begun in Mozambique in 1975, even as the fighting was still going on to liberate the country, and in Angola. The statues were taken down and placed in ministries where they still are. The pedestals can still be seen in Luanda and other cities in the former Portuguese colonies in South Africa. So this was something that was known to South African liberation, to target the statues. And in 2015, a man called Chumani Maxwell, working with a group of other activists, targeted the Rhodes Must Fall statue, the Cecil John Rhodes statue that I showed you a moment ago, in this action, which consisted of throwing human waste at the statue. And you can see that he's wearing a pink helmet and he's got yoga pants on because he's pretending to be a performance artist. There was a performance festival that was opening that day in Cape Town, and in order to not get arrested, Maxwell performed being a performance artist in order to do this action, and you can see the signs that he's carrying with him as well. But his gesture is carrying this box that he brought from the suburb of Khayelitsha, where he lives, to throw human waste onto the statue, which is a bringing then of the world of the dispossessed into and onto the world of statues. So Khayelitsha, where he lives, is a city of about 1 million people. It's growing extremely fast. 99% of those people are African, to use the South African terminology. Over 75% of people there share these chemical toilets that you can see here. Multiple families use them. They're outsourced to a private company. They're not supplied by the state. Now, even these are often broken and very unsanitary and are unsafe at night. So the local people use those boxes that you saw Maxwell using to store their waste overnight, and that provides them with the raw materials for his action. So in his public statement, he says that the action is about, quote, human dignity for the black people living in shacks, as much or more as it was about the university. Now, I'll return to that theme in a moment, but let's just think about how this unfolds a little bit. Rhodes falls very soon after, on the 9th of April, and carted away. And 2 months after that, in Charlottesville, there's an intersection. Black Lives Matter and the statues intersect. And I hope you can read it at the distance you're at, perhaps not, but the graffiti was placed on the base of the statue here saying Black Lives Matter. It was erased almost immediately afterwards, but if you Google the image, you can see it perhaps more clearly than you can on the big screen here. But there is then a literal overlap between the Black Lives Matter movement and the statue movement, if you like, the decolonizing statue movement. By coincidence, in that same month, in 2015, the South African visual activist Zanele Moholy was in Charlottesville, and she made a self-portrait of herself. Now, is there a way to lower the light a little bit so that the screen can be a little more visible to you? So, thank you. So while he helps us with this, let me just say that Moholy describes herself as a visual activist and a black lesbian. Thank you so much. And she works in the LGBTQ community in South Africa, which are guaranteed excellent rights under the Rainbow Constitution of that country. But in practice, people are subject to all kinds of violence, including the extremely offensive and unpleasant, what would we call it, violence of what they call corrective rape. Deliberate rape intended to, as it were, convert a person from one form of sexual orientation to another. In order to support her group, and Moholy works with a whole group of visual activists, she tours worldwide, much like I am now, although probably better paid. And in order to do that, she's often away then from South Africa. And she makes portraits of herself on the road, like this one, and this presumably in a hotel or guest house or something that she's staying in Charlottesville, looking at herself, seeing herself. Now, we can spend some time with the psychoanalytics of that, but it is again about this idea of visual activism, of seeing and being seen, of claiming a place, and particularly in the vocabulary that I myself have used, of claiming the right to look and therefore the right to be seen. In doing that, Moholy places into the world this idea of activating the visual. And what we have seen in the 5 years since this statue activism in South Africa and in Charlottesville, and the present is a variety of actions around the country and around Europe, engaging statues, engaging museums, now the repatriation of cultural property, and very recently, in the last couple of weeks, museums starting to decline donations from wealthy families, including most notoriously, of course, the Sacklers, who are the manufacturers of OxyContin, and that seems to be rolling forward at this moment. So we have there a peculiar and unexpected, to use Stuart Hall's vocabulary, articulation between statues, museums, decolonizing, and contemporary politics, which express what I want to call the new conjuncture that we're currently in. So Stuart's work analyzed the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s. The world that we're in now is notably different in a variety of structural ways. Since 2008, the majority of the world's population has lived in cities for the first time. That number is now around 54%, and it's expected to go to 60% very soon. But of those people, 25%, that's to say a quarter of the world's population, are living in informal housing, what Max Whaley calls shacks, what we might call slums. Those are the people who brought their presence to bear on the world of statues. At the same time, over half the world's population at some time in the last couple of years, and people argue about exactly when this happened, are now online, have some form of online access, and are able then to circulate and to distribute materials in ways that previously would not have been so transparent. So in this moment, we're seeing a resurgence of whiteness as an ideology, and we need then to interrogate what the infrastructure of whiteness is that has allowed it to regenerate, as it were, and to revive notions of white supremacy, despite a long period in which we saw corporate and governmental colorblind multiculturalism, also known as diversity in the university circles, a regime that seems to have spectacularly failed on almost all counts. At the present, we're seeing unemployment and alienation being systemic worldwide, services often marked by their absence. So when I'm talking about infrastructure, I'm talking about all of these things being connected. At the beginning of neoliberalism, Stuart Hall declared, when a conjuncture unrolls, there's no going back. History shifts gears. The terrain changes. You're in a new moment. And here we are again in another new moment. For Stuart in 1978, in Policing the Crisis, the method then was what he called Marx plus Fanon. And here's Frantz Fanon. And for the work that I'm going to share with you here today, my cue comes specifically from Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, where he talks about, quote, a world compartmentalized, Manichaean, immobile, a world of statues, end of quote. And that world of statues produces what I want to call optical distinction, Manichaean in Fanon's terms. Good versus evil, free against enslaved, citizen against migrant. Often enforced by scanners, by facial recognition technology, by closed-circuit television, drones, and other forms of optical equipment. So this digital hierarchical dissemination is nonetheless also articulated with the statue of a colonist on a pedestal, the archaic network that was formerly out of sight and is now again visible and actively part of the racializing hierarchy. For the memorializing statue is not a metaphor. In racial theory, statues are flesh and mind. Part of the global infrastructure of white supremacy and part of the production of segregated urban space. Statues often serve as markers between one segregated zone of a city and another. This is very common in New York, for example. The statue is also a state of mind. And Fanon studied with a French psychiatrist called François Tosquel, who formed a concept of what he called the non-homogeneity of the self during the Spanish Revolution and Civil War of 1936 to 39. And for Tosquel, quote, the personality doesn't consist of a block. If it did, it will be a statue, end of quote. So the white mind is exactly that statue and vice versa. Alternatively, according to Tosquel, when the collective that each person is can engage in collective activity like the Spanish Revolution, the result is less mental trauma. By contrast, as many of us will be familiar with, Freud's analysis of shell shock and the death drive amongst the conscripted soldiers of World War I, who were subjected, of course, to endless bombardments and forced to risk their lives entirely pointlessly. The Spanish Revolution created possibility, even healing. Now, whiteness then is what I'm going to argue as is then this statue, a singular self produced by segregation within the optical space of appearance. So for our purposes, I want to say the world of statues is Fanon plus Hall, rather than Marx plus Fanon. This is then the problem, if you like, of decolonizing racial capitalism. It is not so much ideology, as was the problem in the 1970s, derived from Althusser, but one of media. Whiteness then is infrastructure, supported by institutions and expressed by structures. And I'm thinking here too of Sylvia Wynter's concept of what she calls monohumanism, which is, in her terms, this is a long set of qualifiers, planetarily extended, Western bourgeois, industrial, techno-economic, come globally incorporated Homo economicus, as if it were the being of being. So that's to say that monohumanism is really the only way to be a human being. The modern matrix of power that's coloniality expresses the hierarchy of the human. Outside its boundaries, it imagines a savage world to be kept out, wild, swinish, savage multitude. That is to say, we are always potentially ungovernable, a condition that's not chaos, but the refusal of monohumanist hierarchy. Now, in the North Atlantic world, formed by transatlantic slavery, there's a matrix of mapping, segregation, separation, and the formation of this compartmentalized Manichaean immobile world of statues that I want to explore for you visually. So this is the classic scene of transatlantic slavery, the plantation, and the overseer standing here in a landscape that it was once wild but has now been disciplined and organized into a multi-part labor process. This is the production of indigo, which is the product that makes the blue dye that makes your jeans blue. So we still live in this world. It's still part of our daily understanding. This is the island on which that map is taking place. This is a colonial textbook produced by a Jesuit missionary called Dutertre, actively used by colonists, and this is the island of Martinique. And you can see that it's divided between the French zone, Demir-François, and the wild zone. And there's a line that goes down the middle of it. And we can imagine certain people that might want to build a wall along that line. But that long sense then of a division between the wild zone and the civilized zone. Here's the overseer then, standing posed elegantly. He's carrying a stick, which is the implicit threat of violence that he will use. But in this ideological moment, he's standing rather like, as if a dandy, you know, counter-posture against his weight is balanced on this stick, dominating the scene by his ability to overlook it and to, in English the pun works, oversee it. There's a kind of magic then to running a plantation. Visually, it's a surrogation. It's a surrogation of sovereignty. In this particular instance is a portrait by Van Dyck of the British monarch Charles I, standing in the same way, posed on his stick, and you can just see in the water here some ships. And if the ships are in the water, to a 17th century viewer, that tells you they're not docked, which is to say there's necessarily a colonial situation. So there is then a relationship of surrogation and sublimation into a figure that will become statue. In the British island of Barbados in 1661, this becomes a formal law code under the regulation of, quote, an act for the better ordering and governing of Negroes, the Barbados Slave Code of 1661. And this from a text describing the colonization of Barbados by Richard Ligon, showing that the fugitive, as Fred Moden puts it, is a formative figure in the practice of coloniality. In what the law code calls the absolute condition of enslavement, in the same way that the absolute sovereign Charles I claims to dominate everything, its ordering applies to all Africans, the indigenous, and to all children that those people might have, regardless of parenthood, whether by settlers or others. So I would suggest that this regime of ordering and governing continues to be enforced under the modern matrix of power that Anibal Quijano and others have called coloniality. And this is further embraced by the concept of the state as Leviathan, again almost exactly contemporary engraving by Abraham Bosse, the French engraver of the frontispiece to Thomas Hobbes' classic. And the figure of Leviathan is a single person incorporating, as you can see, everyone else who has supposedly consented to be subsumed by the state. It is again a colonial setting. So this is a detail of his stick that you see coming down the side here, like the statue, like the monarch. Excuse me, wrong way. And you'll see under here, again, ships in the water and a colonial fort. So Leviathan is standing in the water. His legs are actually underwater because Leviathan is classically a sea monster. He is then a colonial figure. And he dominates that landscape, dominates the colonial fort, and has a separation between his zone and this other zone. The French zone on the one hand, this is the savage zone. If you can read at this distance, it's the space of the so-called Caribs. And this is a specific indicated space where the Caribs have their assemblies. That is to say then that while democracy precedes coloniality and prefigures ungovernability or the ungovernable, colonists then must be united to counter that always already existing resistance. In Hobbes' imaginary, which is depicted in his other text, De Cive, while democracy on this side, libertas, precedes power or imperium or empire. In other words, colonial order. The Kalinago, who the Caribs, that is what the Caribs actually call themselves, were famed for their dedication to freedom. Another missionary noted that they, quote, prefer to die of hunger than to live as a slave. So for Kalinago, you might end your life to return to the ancestors in the cosmographic expectation of a return to a differently organized space. And people from Congo would also do the same kind of thing. Kalinago's tactic during the period was what one historian has called strike and sail, meaning that they abandoned one place and sailed to another. The seaborne form of being ungovernable. They simply refused to stay where coloniality was. Now, by the time they abandoned Martinique in 1660, which is around the time of Leviathan and around the time of these maps that I'm showing you, it was then already a 150-year strike against slavery. In the enclosed island space, Leviathan claims absolute power, producing the first modern proletariat, as C.L.R. James had it, the enslaved workforce. And so I want to say then that the Confederate Memorial, which has become such an item of controversy and discussion in the contemporary United States, is a condensation of all of that. It's visually the same. It's a figure of a man with a stick, albeit it's a rifle now, rephrasing the coloniality of Leviathan as the state and the overseer as racial capitalism in North America, because we know that these monuments are above all monuments to white supremacy, and they will often say that in the carving on the statue itself. By the same token, when the enslaved established Haiti in 1804, first successful revolution of the enslaved against coloniality, they renamed the country using a word from the indigenous Taino language, Haiti. And what it means is highlands, the classic locale of the ungovernable. Past then is prologue, sometimes to revolution, sometimes to reaction. During the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture becomes a hero, a statue in his own right. And you see here that he's again dominating the same two figures. Toussaint's figure dominates the colonial fort and the ship in the same way that we saw in the portrait of Charles I and in Leviathan. And whoever made this, and I like to imagine it was a woman who we know to have been the first African-American diaspora artist, a woman called Madame Lafayette. She may have made it, who knows who made it, but nonetheless, whoever made this knew what they were doing. They knew how to represent Toussaint as a hero against coloniality. The ungoverned outside of coloniality, as the Wild Assembly, the strike, and the sailing had come together in the overthrow of racial capital. And here then, Toussaint as a hero abolishes the boundary between the free and the enslaved, and ends the magic of enslavement. In the Haitian Constitution of 1804, anyone who lives in the island of Haiti is defined as being black, which has obviously no relation to descent or to phenotype, but is an affiliation with revolution. Now, the second part of this presentation, I want to think through then how post the Haitian Revolution has been established a hierarchy of the human that continues to be operative. We know such hierarchies not because they are scientifically accurate, but through media, through visual form. In this study of human nature that was published in 1801, precisely in the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution and the moment in which museums were first established in Western Europe, the French naturalist Julien-Joseph Virey discerned three distinct human species. But in this illustration, which was highly widely circulated and influential in both in the period and subsequently, Virey depicts, as you can see, an orangutan, then a supposed African person, and whiteness is depicted not as a person but as a statue. In this case, as the image of the Apollo Belvedere, one of the most famous of ancient Greek sculptures. Despite Haiti, Virey declared that other than Europeans, there was nothing but, quote, a vile rabble of barbarians. Hence, world empire is European destiny. So the statue then is empire. Empire is in material form. These ideas were widely disseminated across the United States by these figures, people called Josiah Nott and George Glidden in their 1854 Types of Man. There was a bestseller of white supremacy. Frederick Douglass critiqued it extensively. And in their book, they claim that, quote, there are many primitive types of mankind were created. The evidence for this is, again, classical sculpture, as, again, evidenced supposedly by skulls. And this is a collection of a man called Samuel Morton. Now, we may think of this as ancient history, but this skull collection is still at the University of Pennsylvania on public display. There's a website which they advertise it, and this is where I took this picture, and you can see very offensively it says, Negro born in Africa. And what happens here, these are enslaved human beings who died on the Middle Passage and whose skeletons were then harvested in Cuba and sold to so-called race science to gain some sort of profit out of the human trafficking of forced migration. So Penn has put these things back on display. Its website claims that in an undergraduate paper of 2008, some unnamed Penn student disproved Stephen Jay Gould's debunking of race science in The Mismeasure of Man, which is to say that there is some form of accuracy supposedly depicted by these skulls. What this, to reprise the historical narrative, led to was the idea of replacement, the idea that there was a threat to the elite, minoritarian, white ideal as depicted by the Apollo Belvedere that became part of general popular culture during the First World War in the United States, in the idea of the passing of the great race. This is a popular book by a man called Madison Grant, which was later, unfortunately, much admired by Adolf Hitler. And Grant was motivated to this idea by seeing media photographs in the period like this in the English media of people who died or been injured during the First World War. And he continually notices and admires their whiteness and is afraid that because of the mass death of the First World War that there won't be enough white people left. For Grant, race, I'm quoting him, implies heredity. And heredity implies all the moral, racial, and intellectual characteristics and traits which are the spring of politics and government. Conservation of that race has given us the true spirit of Americanism. Now, this book was enormously popular. It was widely praised by the President Theodore Roosevelt, and the preface was written by a man called Henry Fairfield Osborn. Osborn was a zoologist and paleontologist who became director of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, where he hosted the Second International Eugenics Conference in 1921. And you probably think you don't know anything about this, but if you read Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon cites it as one of the sites of toxic white supremacy ideology, as he well might. And it was entirely natural for them to create at this conference, a statue representing the Nordic white figure, derived from the vital statistics of 100,000 US soldiers during the First World War, statue made by an otherwise perfectly reasonable artist called Jane Davenport. In this statue then is incarnated the idea of a racialized hierarchy within whiteness, that not all whiteness is equal. Nordic whiteness, whiteness descended from Scandinavia, the UK, and Germany, is superior to Southern and Eastern whiteness and is seen as being under threat. The sculpture then begins its work as part of the unseen operations of enforcing consent, because in 1924, Osborn helped pass the Immigration Act, which radically limited immigration to the United States from Southern and Eastern Europe. On the grounds of this kind of diagram that was also circulated at the 1921 Eugenics Conference, and probably, unless you have very good eyesight, can't read the text. It's like what it purports to show is the approaching extinction of the Mayflower descendants. So the peak of the curve here is the exact moment of the exhibition, 1920, and this radical drop-off is about to happen, where the idealized Native American, as ironically eugenic texts refer to European settler colonialists, is about to happen. So you have to radically limit immigration. That's indeed what the 1924 Act did. Outside of the American Museum of Natural History today is a statue that commemorates precisely these ideas. It was campaigned for by Osborn as soon as Roosevelt died in 1919. The statue finally went up after fundraising in 1936 and remains in place today. It was sculpted by a man called James Earl Fraser. Now, Roosevelt believed in a hierarchy of the races. He talked about what he called the forward race, which is meaning white people, and backward races, meaning, in particular, African Americans. He said of indigenous populations that 9 out of 10 Indians deserved to die. Now, in the review of this sculpture that was done by the New York City Mayor's Monuments Commission, a totally different interpretation was presented. This is, I'm quoting from their report, the sculpture was meant to represent Roosevelt's belief in the unity of the races. Now, even if you simply look at the figures, the one on the left here that you're looking at, it represents a generic African person, the one on the right is supposed to represent a generic indigenous American. there's simply no way that that makes visual sense. But as soon as you analyze it in terms of the then understood racial hierarchies, and these are composites that I put together for this event, you can see that Fraser clearly intended to incorporate the hierarchy of the race through skull shape. This is Roosevelt's head, and you can see it's this ridiculously long, straight forehead, just like this skull from Norton Glidden, and then a nice flat over here. This is called a long skull. This is the African figure. I had to flip the offensive illustration to give you the sense on the other side. These are supposedly round skulls. And again, you see the long roundness, it bulges towards the back rather than the front, just like the curve here. And this is the indigenous person. This is a skull of a native person taken from Norton Glidden, and I flipped it so you can see it. Peculiar angle. So the idea of the skull here then, oops, excuse me, that's the wrong one. Skull here with a bump in it, just like there's a bump here, and this long curve around the back. So this statue visibly incarnates the idea of racial hierarchy and eugenics, which the American Museum of Natural History intended to promote. The idea was that they were going to build a thing called the Hall of the Great Race, the white race, that was never constructed in the aftermath of the Second World War. But the American Museum of Natural History continues to hold materials that were collected and disseminated in support of the idea of eugenics, including human remains, particularly those of Ovaherero and Nama people from what is now Namibia, who were killed during the genocide of 1904 to 8, and whose skulls were literally harvested and packed up and then shipped to Europe, where they were sold in Germany. This is a rather poor copy of a photograph, but you get the general idea here, that here then are a set of skulls that have been collected and now being shipped to Europe for the benefit of so-called race science. Amongst the purchasers of these skulls were the American Museum of Natural History. And here they are. They're still in a basement on the Upper West Side. They're not on public display. And these materials were gathered during the course of a law case. You can see that they've literally been written on. Herero, which is the abbreviation of Ovaherero, as the people themselves would name themselves, kept in a cardboard box up there, safe for racial science. These were purchased in 1924 by the gift of a man called Felix Warburg, who was a banker, but was also a trustee of the museum and a department head, the head of the education department at the museum. Now, these human remains are also the grounds on which the traditional authorities in Namibia are suing the German government for genocide in the US Southern District of New York. That was recently rejected under the Foreign Sovereignty Immunity Act. An appeal is forthcoming, and we'll see what happens with that. So let's think about the continuity then. In 1924, the statue of Robert E. Lee goes up in Charlottesville. In 1924, the United States passes the Immigration Act that radically limits immigration from anyone other than Nordic whites. And in 1924, the American Museum of Natural History purchases 5,000 items of human remains that continue to be used in the museum. And in fact, when the New Yorker wrote a piece about this and asked them the obvious question, which is, why don't you just give these things back? It turns out this is still the most used collection of materials in the museum for presumably anthropological and quasi-scientific purposes. So all of the ideas that are incarnated in these racist stereotypes continue to walk the earth. The idea of Nordic whiteness, for example, excludes Poles from the question of whiteness. Poles are now hated in my native UK as Brexit has revived a very peculiar form of white supremacy. It excludes Jews. There's an obvious and palpable anti-Semitism that's visible to all of us. the idea of replacement theory that motivated the entire apparatus is what motivated the marchers at Charlottesville, the novelist Michel Houellebecq, and the Christchurch shooter. And it explains the otherwise peculiar statement that was made at Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. What that means then, and this is a surprising form of racial science, that according to replacement theory, Nordic whites, as symbolized by the statue of Robert E. Lee and elsewhere, if they were to be displaced, their replacement would be Jews, because eugenics held that, and I'm quoting here, next to the Teutonic, the Jewish spirit is the chief motive force of modern Western civilization. End quote. So notice two things here. Notice that the very concept of modern Western civilization is itself eugenic. It's part of race science. This was understood very clearly by, for example, Stephen King of Iowa, when he made this statement about how did white supremacy and Western civilization become banned terminology. It's a paraphrase, but it's essentially what King said. Now, Jews then are particularly important in racial theory because we are said to epitomize and exemplify the persistence of racial character and therefore its truth. It's a commonplace of such theories that Jews dominate the media. When I say these theories, I'm talking about 1930s eugenic racial theories. But it will also be noticeable that Trump endlessly attacks the media and endlessly critiques them. Trumpism is also, of course, paradoxically invested in Jewish settler colonialism in Palestine as part of its racial nationalism. And Richard Spencer, who led the protest at Charlottesville, has a name for this. He calls it white Zionism. And what he means by this is, in effect, have all the Jews live in Israel so that all the whites can live in the United States, where they can now claim to be indigenous. And world forgetting, amongst other things, of the Monacan people who are actually indigenous to what is now Charlottesville. So in the face of all this, what is to be done? To quote Lenin, or better, what are the lessons of the hour? To borrow Frederick Douglass's lecture of 1861, that's also the title of Isaac Julian's new film that's on display in New York right now. If any of you get over there, strongly recommend seeing this. The world of statues as a network of white supremacy will not be undone, I think, by one single action, whether winning an election or even a revolutionary uprising. It's going to be about taking apart the thousands of links and nodes that constitute the network of whiteness. And I'm going to give you then one example of how we might do this work from my own work, and I'll make some suggestions as to how we might extend it into the university. So here's an exhibition that it's just closing tomorrow, actually, that's in Copenhagen, called Decolonizing Appearance. It intervenes in a Denmark where Nordic whiteness is once again high on the agenda. Areas where non-European migrants live in Denmark are legally designated as ghettos. Children living in ghettos must take 25 hours a week of Danish cultural values, and if you commit a criminal offense in a ghetto area, you receive double the penalty. Asylum seekers cannot work, cannot claim benefits, cannot accept cash donations, and they are currently detained in camps run by the prison service, even though under the 1951 Geneva Convention, claiming asylum is a human right. The space then in which this exhibition was held is a space called Trampoline House, which is a community justice space for asylum seekers, providing them with facilities, food, computer access, language classes, legal aid, and cultural resources like the exhibition. So the exhibition's primary audience is the asylum seeker. But rather than start with the exhibition, I want to start by showing you the conditions in which the asylum seekers are forced to live. So one of their camps is called Sjælsmark, and was taken there by a refugee from Eritrea who has actually subsequently managed to achieve resident status in Denmark. And she described this living in this camp as a form of torture. But it's not physical torture as in the manifestation of, say, the Gestapo. It's psychological torture because nothing is allowed in this camp. These are the spaces in which people live, and there are over 100 children in Sjælsmark in these former military barracks. Nothing is permitted on the walls. The only furniture is that which you're seeing here, a table and chairs. There's a mattress on the floor. There's no radio, there's no TV, there's no internet. You're not even allowed to put a picture on the wall. Even more than that, you're not even allowed to cook. And this is actually a contraband toaster oven that they had acquired, that they expected to be confiscated the next time there was an inspection. Again, in a manner of mass incarceration. You have your living space inspected, even though you're not guilty of any criminal offense. The food was widely described by all the refugees that I met as inedible, and it's also typically for Danish food filled with pork products, most of which were forbidden to people of Muslim background who mostly live in these camps. So the idea of torture then is one of sensory deprivation. It's the inability to see, do anything. And it's at the same time the making invisible of the refugee, because these camps are about 25 kilometers outside of Copenhagen. It's an easy drive, but obviously they don't have access to cars. By public transport, it takes at least 2 hours. And when the camp is closed at night at 10 p.m., they lock the gate and they won't let you back in, even if that's where you live. So it's difficult to journey in and out of the city. Recent announcements have established that refugees will now be forced to live on a remote island, formerly used for animal pathogen testing. Denmark is formally committed now to accepting no refugees or asylum seekers at all, and to returning everyone to what they call their home country. The European Union has said that it will no longer be doing sea voyages to rescue potential migrants if they are wrecked. And Denmark is facilitated then in all of this hierarchy by something called the European Union Dublin Regulation, which stipulates that all asylum seekers must seek asylum in the country in which their fingerprints were first taken. So just like the eugenicist Francis Galton adopted the fingerprinting system of identification from colonial India in the late 19th century, where it was used because colonial officials could not tell people apart, there's a thing called Eurodac, which is the European Dactylology database, where all asylum seekers are fingerprinted. It's a biometric database, and it's used because asylum seekers are presumed to be liars. Digital fingerprints are now the prime mover of the refugee system. And it's in effect impossible for any refugee to make their first entry into the Schengen area via Denmark, so the country is legally entitled to refuse all such claims. And it's gone still further now into a peculiar revanchism in which Denmark now dramatically re-identifies with the Viking. So there are Viking museums everywhere. The official website, Denmark has a website, strangely, and the first sentence says, "We are descended from brutal Vikings." So the once progressive Scandinavia has reverted to the eugenic rhetoric and practice of the 1930s of Nordic whiteness. And there are two counters to that I want to quickly show you. One is this statue, monumental statue made by two Caribbean Danish women called I Am Queen Mary. Queen Mary was a rebel on the now American island of St. Croix, which is in the Virgin Islands, then Danish, in 1858 against the sharecropping regime of the time. And this statue stands outside the Royal Colonial Warehouse, in which classical casts of ancient Greek and Roman sculptures are contained. So this monumental black sculpture is outside. It's actually made of a form of polystyrene, so that when the wind blows, her machete waves kind of threateningly in the wind. The second object is my exhibition, which I mentioned before, which argues for decolonizing appearance. I'm showing you here a set of posters by the African-American artist Carl Pope. So what would it mean then to appear? It's first to claim the right to exist and to possess one's body, whether in terms of enslavement, reproductive rights, or gender and sexual identity in the way of Zanella Maholi. To appear is to matter, as in the case of Black Lives Matter, to be grievable, to be a person that counts for something. And it's to be able to claim the right to look within that space. In appearing, I see you, you see me, and a space is formed by that exchange, which by consent can be mediated into shareable and distributable forms. People inevitably appear unequally because history, of course, does not disappear. And so finally, this is the panel at the opening. I want to just conclude with this artwork by the same sculptor that made the piece Queen Mary. This is her piece in our show. It's called The Gaze. All the people in this image here, this is Jeanette Ayres, the sculptor here, but all the rest of them are asylum seekers and refugees, many of whom spend time in Trampoline House. And the piece is called The Gaze, and it's a two-screen piece. And on the far side, individual photographs appear in extremely high resolution, and I hope you can see this even on this giant screen, that you can see even the way in which the pupils of the eye kind of slightly dent. We get very close up, and they all seem to slightly tear up as we look at them. And of course, you know, I don't need to explain to you, sophisticated audience here, what concepts of the gaze. Nothing is said until right at the end, when this woman says, "We are here because you were there." And this is to reprise then the famous statement of Darcus Howe, later disseminated by Stuart Hall, in understanding the previous crisis of the conjuncture in the 1970s, that reprises and replays itself today. So in thinking about what would it mean then to accept that people are here because we were there, we might then want, I'm going to skip a couple of slides because I'm over time. What would we do in a university context? And I would suggest the following tactics might work. That we begin all of our events with the territorial acknowledgement, which is to say this is stolen land. I mean, it's a land grant university, yes, but it's stolen land. It belongs to the indigenous peoples of North America. We might think about what I call decompartmentalizing the curriculum in the manner of the compartmentalized world of coloniality, which is to say if your syllabus has a week for race or a week for gender and the other weeks are white blokes, no. Decompartmentalize it. Figure out how to make sure that every week is anti-racist, decolonial. Publish through open source publishing so that people in non-highly resourced areas of the world, including perhaps certain regions of Milwaukee, have access to that publishing rather than what has become the standard $100 or £100 academic text. Think about how to recruit your students and faculty. Not to say anything of your university, but my university is wildly disproportionately unrepresentative of New York City, despite the fact our motto is in and of the city. We have 4% African American students, 4% African American faculty in a city which is about 25% African American. And then perhaps last but not least, think about how to repatriate cultural property in museums and other places, and how to remove racist monuments. So I'll leave you with that. I'm sorry I went on a bit long, but I didn't want to leave you with just the really negative stuff, to pitch it up a little bit more optimistically at the end. Thank you for persisting.
You want to do your own
question? Very happy to answer questions. I've got nothing to do until tomorrow morning. Yeah.
Thanks, Nick. That was amazing. And thank you for talking about the whole replacement thing, which has been really confusing to me because I don't really aspire to replace anyone. So I thought you gave a great, so I have two questions. The first is about replacement, and thank you so much for providing that incredible genealogy of that. My question is about, you know, when they were saying that at Charlottesville, I was like, where the heck did that come from? And I think you really drew a pretty complicated and interesting and really illuminating picture. What I don't understand is how it gets popularized. Like, how did those guys who don't know the stuff, the amazing stuff you just told us, like, how did they pick up that word? You know, like, I don't understand how that, yeah. So can you talk more about that?
Essentially, it's Reddit, it's 8chan, it's 4chan, it's the discussion boards.
So it's in the discourse replacement, and they're picking it up from there.
So part of it comes directly from Anders Breivik, and he published a long manifesto before he conducted that massacre in Norway. There's a movie about that now. And replacement is central to his manifesto there. So from there, it's a term that now circulates in the alt-right. And so, it's not particularly pleasant work, but you could figure out a genealogy that goes from Breivik to the Christchurch shooter via Charlottesville. And its roots then are in this eugenic hierarchy of the human that goes back to the Haitian Revolution. So it's important to understand then that we're not going to get rid of this by sort of flicking our fingers. This has long roots and material infrastructures that support it, that are not just the statues when you take down one, but there are thousands of them. It's, and the reason I wanted to concentrate on New York is to say, it's not just Alabama people, although Alabama is actually in places like Memphis and so on have done more work on this than frankly New York has. It's right in the heart of the most liberal Upper West Side, literally under the ground in Central Park, the human remains that are propping up the American Museum of Natural History, but also propping up this idea of replacement. So at one level it's a crazy idea, but it's also an idea that seems to people to make sense. When I see people in the UK, where I'm from, turning on people who don't speak English in the street, as happens now on a regular basis. And a friend of mine who's German has quit the UK because he said, it's just not worth it anymore. Every single day. In London, at Queen Mary College, again, not in some mythologized, deindustrialized city in the north, it's not those people. It's in the heart of the metropole that he's been driven out just because his English is slightly different. And somehow a generation that grown up mythologizing the Second World War that did not experience it has nonetheless managed to use the ideology of the country that they fought during that war. So it is an intensely peculiar moment in that way. And there's all these kind of loops historically, where it seems that time seems to me now to be more of a palimpsest, or maybe there's a better metaphor than that, but ways in which totally different periods of time now appear absolutely connected in this unusual way through this idea of replacement.
Yeah, that's really, okay, thank you. My other question was about, I thought you were saying, gesturing through Fanon to the unitary subject, this notion of the unitary subject, the statue, being a colonial notion. And can you say just a little more about that? Because that's also really helpful. Sure.
So, this is, through decolonial ideology, when Fanon talks about the world of statues, I wanted to take him seriously at a literal level and say, there is a world of statues. They're all over the place. And they do visibly manifest the kind of hierarchy that we're talking about. But then there's also a metaphor that's involved there. We can want to say that decolonization is not a metaphor. But then it's also an understanding of monohumanism, to use Winter's term, that there is one type of the human, that is the being of being, which is the Nordic white, which is manifested through the statue. And that body has certain characteristics, that it is all-powerful, that it is sovereign, that it dominates, that it has singularity, and that it has a particular kind of mentality, which is what Tosquel is talking about, the idea of the mind as a block. And so adjacent to that then is my sense, and Fanon's sense too, obviously very clearly, that one of the things that coloniality produces is what he calls alienation. And there's a very thick new volume of his psychological writings that go into great detail about that. In this country, 1 in 6 Americans, and most of those are white people, are on antidepressants. And the single highest form of health care expenditure from insurance is antidepressants. So that suggests that this regime, as Fanon would say, is literally driving us crazy. Yeah.
Is this on?
Yeah,
he handed
on.
this to me. So,
Hi, Jen.
okay, so I want to pursue the statue thing a little bit more in a direction, and thank you for your talk, first of all. So I'm thinking a lot of the three-part hierarchy, which has the orangutan at the bottom and the African man in the middle. And at the top, I thought at first it was a white man, but it is a statue. Right. And so one of the things it feels like, and that's what I'm thinking about, is that in fact, whiteness is not connected to humanity. The human is somewhere between the statue and the animal. So the human ends up actually being located in the place of the African man, right? And that, I mean, and this is a part of, I mean, it's hard not to think of Fanon and to think of Lacan, right? And the armored being as the non-human, as the upright, etc. And so, I mean, which is connecting to also what you're saying about the craziness of this image, which is not an image of humanity. It's an image of the statue, of the completely non-animal, of the completely, non-mobile, immobile, etc. And so I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about, because it feels like that's what, I mean, I was really surprised that in that statement that what's representing whiteness is not a white person, but a statue.
Exactly. So when I used to teach this, I've been teaching this image for a long time, and I said earlier in the panel that some of you were in earlier on, this is an odd cycle in my own life here, because I was writing about the American Museum of Natural History and statues and things in the early 90s, and that seemed to then be a thing that was done, and now it's back, in this way. So what I used to say, make fun of exactly that you can't find a white person that's ideal enough to represent whiteness. But in fact, going back and actually reading these texts again now, I realized that they're aware of that. And their problem, if you like, is that they have this idea of uncontaminated whiteness that exists nowhere. So they state this, and they state that what they call amalgamation, which is the euphemism for what American racist language calls miscegenation, that we don't, which actually is a meaningless term in your own way of thinking about it, because there's no mixing. We're all humans. And if we weren't, then we wouldn't be able to reproduce with each other anyway. But they actually, of course, will theorize the possibility of what they call amalgamation with primate species, but that's a whole separate theory. But the point then is precisely this. They know that from what we might call time immemorial, there has been such amalgamation. So the ideal type no longer exists. It can only be found in these remains of previous ideality that no longer can. So the modern day Greek in no way represents the Greek ideal. And the modern day white person can only aspire to. So it's kind of very Platonic theory, that there's this idea of whiteness, but as you're right, it's an idea that has no material or fleshly, to use Wahelia's phrase, basis. Right? You can't embody it because of history. And as a result, it appears to us to be entirely internally self-contradictory. And yet it supports itself because of this, this idealism that has so long been structured as the philosophy of philosophy. If we think from Hegel forward, idealism is philosophy to a certain extent. And I think we have to then de-idealize our philosophy, and perhaps through Lacan, or perhaps through other whatever works. And I think we'll want a multiplicity of strategies. I'm not enough of a Lacanian, you can do that work. To do that, in order to be able to imagine what a non-homogeneous, non-singular humanity would look like. Young man in the front.
Thanks. So I was thinking during your talk about this idea that kind of comes up within the construction of whiteness, of this idea of like the dissociated intellect, that the idea of whiteness and the worldview of whiteness is often associated with this disassociated intellect away from the corporeal body. And thinking about that in relation to the idea of a statue, and it seems to either support or complicate that, because either it's a statue that doesn't have, you can't put a brain in there because it's made of marble and it's separated, or it's this idea of sort of the idealized body that it can be a part of, whereas we often think about, this idea of corporeality being placed onto blackness. So I'm just curious, how does that play into this work? What's the conversation between those two ideas, I suppose?
So again, interestingly, this is a reprise. I've got a whole book on this called Bodyscape, which is about the tension between the idealized body and what we were then calling the fragmented body, in a very kind of postmodernist kind of way, that seems again to be returned, but I want to suggest that it's returned in this different context where it's also articulated, to use Stuart's phraseology, there's a connection between these long-standing racialized and historical ideas and the digital database, which is, I didn't have enough time to really go into this, but I think it's absolutely key to understanding this, that migration and so many of our everyday activities are determined by positionalities within the digital databases. Eurodac is a particularly extreme example of this, in which your data is allowed to be kept if you're a migrant for over a decade. But it's only your fingerprints that count. So the rest of your body is irrelevant. The rest of your history is irrelevant. It's this. And the first place that some guy has taken, again, I was running short of time, so I didn't speak about it, but I took a stock German photograph from DPA, which is the kind of German press photo. And you'll notice that if we look at that picture, that it's a person wearing a surgical glove who's pressing a visibly dark brown hand onto the photo scanner. And that then, to me, that's the fragmented, but in that metonymic there, you've got everything, right? You've got racialized hierarchy, you've got the threat of the brown body as a potential contaminant to whiteness, and the necessity of recording it in a non-forgetting, permanent, digitized form that will never allow you to appear elsewhere, even if you become fugitive. And it's the same anxiety that Richard Lygon has in 1657, and that the Act of Ordering and Governing in Barbados does, that the enslaved will run away, because they do. And so by the same token, the migrant and the asylum seeker have the agency to remove themselves. So they're anticipating that, and they're saying, through this, we'll know you. Yeah.
Well, thank you for a really interesting talk. I mean, in some sense, it's amazing to see how the Nordic comes to replace the Greek.
Yes, indeed. Exactly.
But I had actually two floating questions in my head, which are not very clear yet. One was your idea of the conjuncture, and how, in a sense, though each conjuncture is a new moment, there is an extraordinary continuity. And I was actually thinking of, say, if one might think of the long 20th century, I mean, not to replace your argument,
Sure.
simply to maybe think of another layer which one might pull out. Then you see that the late 19th, early 20th century, which was when digitization began, as you pointed out, the fingerprints and so on. That was also the moment the passport was invented. That was also the moment where British administrators were very straightforwardly and explicitly, they were actually non-ideological, they were so transparent. They were saying things like, Australia, Canada are really good places for Europeans to settle, because there's no pre-existing population there.
Right.
But South Africa is terrifying, because it is a majority black population, which they actually explicitly said cannot be done away with, short of using a word like exterminated. So there is this sense then that when you see an Australian coming to New Zealand in order to perform a massacre, as happened 2 weeks ago, I was suddenly thinking of that long 20th century, and I was saying it hasn't ended. This is the point, and that was the time when actually, one of the genesis of apartheid policies, labor apartheid, came from Australia to South Africa.
Right.
So some of these things I thought, were coming awake as I heard
Absolutely.
you. And the other thing that I thought was very interesting, when you think of Face Forward, is the divisions among, what is seen as a consolidated block of white power. If you look at the Polish, for instance, now the Polish, when in the so-called refugee crisis, because refugees were going all over the world, they were not just going to Europe, they were putting the heads of slaughtered pigs on the spikes of the border fences, thinking that because, pork is considered to be haram, no Muslims will now want to enter. Now these are the same,
Bloody hell.
people from that same national body
Right.
are being deeply discriminated against right now in the UK.
Yes, absolutely.
Openly, deeply, viciously even. So what does, the question I have is, why doesn't white power fracture at these points?
Why indeed? So, I think it's very, to take the first part of your question, the notion of conjuncture that Stewart develops in relation to the formation of neoliberalism in the 1970s and early 80s seems to me to be temporally specific now. In other words, there was a conjuncture that was formed by what, for the sake of time, let's agree to call neoliberalism, that lasted from sometime in the 70s to roughly, I think, 2008. And what the peculiarity of that moment, as we see it now, is this kind of freezing of temporality, that everything in that time is subordinate to this logic of markets and economics, and the economic is dominant over everything else. What seems to have happened post-2008 is a dissolving of that conjuncture into what I was calling disjuncture, in which what is precisely happening is a revival of all these apparently frozen technologies and modes of distinction that had appeared to us to be set into the past that are now active again. And so your examples are all very well taken. I mean, I'm struck by the example of the decapitated animal as being, that was of course a technology of enslavement as well, that those who revolted against slavery were decapitated and their heads were used to terrify.
And all the skulls collected here.
Right.
I mean, there's the animal skull here.
Right. And so when we think about, the formation of apartheid and of Manichaean coloniality, to use Fanon's terminology, appearance is central to that. I mean, the apartheid laws are very careful to distinguish between people who appear to be white, but are in fact not, and people who appear not to be white, but in fact are. And you can move categories. There are court cases, where you can shift from being colored to being white, and Chinese to being white, but never black to white. So I think, why doesn't whiteness fracture? Because it invests absolutely everything in sustaining the color line. That without, the entire apparatus is centered around the maintenance of that. And it doesn't operate logically. So that it operates affectively, it operates at the level of bodies, to take the, you were talking about contemporary Britain. And I mean, think about what's going on in the street that I've seen in London recently. So to support Brexit, in a demonstration in the street of London, there's a white man wearing a gilet jaune. So you're wearing a European mark of disaffiliation with the French bureaucracy to suggest that you want to leave the European Union first. Second, what he's doing is he's carrying, and this is less funny, carrying a noose. Now that's then obviously an American symbol of lynching. So what I think is, and what I wanted to suggest earlier on was what I think is happening, and I think this goes to points that pretty much everybody has made, is that through the long histories that you've described, and through the affective experience of transnational globalization, there is now a transnational white supremacy that is deeply illogical, but deeply violent, because violence is illogical at some level, right? I mean, you take Jane's point, and at any level of rationality, it's all insane. But at the level of experience, at the level of what Fanon wants to call, and we need to think of as violence, but not violence committed by the colonized against the colonizer, but precisely the violence of coloniality that has this 400-year history to it, that is now starting in precisely its moment of terror in both meanings, and that it's terrified that it may be about to fall, but it's also instituting a regime of terror, is drawing on all its resources to try and sustain itself in the face of, what the terror that the demographics are moving against it, the terror that the resources are running out, that the profitability of capital is no longer sustainable, that the regime of white supremacy itself is no longer sustainable. The response to that is terror from all the sources that you've described. Yes, hi.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just am sorry to focus again on the UK again, but this discussion about sites where whiteness fractures, or reminded me of a recent article by Patrick Gathara. He's a Kenyan journalist, and he wrote an article on the path to colonial reckoning is through the archives, not the museum. And he kind of has his argument distilled is more so that there's that the repatriation and removal of visual and material culture can actually at the base of it, it can appear to be like face saving, whereas the actual repatriation of the colonial archives could actually give more agency to those colonial groups to rewrite the narratives. And I was specifically interested in the UK because there's the active destruction of some of those colonial archives that the Kenyans that a lot of colonial former colonies are contesting in court. And I was just wondering if the archives and the museum, if you could talk about different sites of where that resistance or stuff like that could take place.
No, it's a great question. And I mean, look, you're entirely right. I think museums are a kind of archive in some ways. They're also a site, if we think of the British Museum, I mean, it's an obvious monument to colonialism. That's really all it is. And there's a young woman called Alice Proctor who does these things called the Uncomfortable Art Tour around the British Museum, pointing out its coloniality in various places. So most notably recently, and I made this point to a group earlier on, but it's relevant here, there's a statue in the British Museum from Rapa Nui, Easter Island, which has been identified by contemporary folks on Rapa Nui as their ancestor, not as a statue of their ancestor, but as their ancestor. And they're asking for him to be returned. And the British saying, well, we could lend him. As if you own him, which is slavery, no? And the same is true of if you want to work on so much of British colonial history, you're going to have to go to London. You have to go to the East India Office to find out enormous amounts about the Indian subcontinent and so on, or about the Caribbean and many other locations. And access to archives is always highly limited and highly constrained. And here then, open source is the solution to that, right? Because it's entirely possible to digitize these things and to say, here, have this material. And that was the potential that those of us who were around in the first wave of the digital revolution in the 90s. This is what we thought was going to happen, right? And then it got Facebooked and it got Amazoned and it got Microsofted and Googled, and suddenly it's ring-fenced and boundaried. But that potential is still there, and I think it's something that we as scholars should use the privilege that we have to call for it. But doing it by leading from our own example and saying, here, my work is open source. So you can, all my stuff is on my website, and all the stuff that I do now, I publish open source. And for those of us that have the shrinking privilege of tenure, one of the things you can actually do is when sort of the Routledges and the Brills come along to you and say, okay, we're having the copyright of this article for eternity, you just say no. And what mostly happens is they go, oh, well, all right then, do you want it? And you go, yeah, actually, I'll have that, thanks. Okay, because, really, how much money is there to be made off one? It's not the patent to a cancer drug or something. But it's not without importance. It's not without importance. And it's really important that we give people who don't have the access to the library here or to the resources here in South Africa, for example, or in many other locations, access to materials that we've, even textbooks and things of that kind, that are widely available here, of course, extremely limited expense, right? So to conclude, just one way of thinking about this right at the end, in David Graeber's book on debt, he has this example of what he calls basic communism. And he thinks that social order is structured around sharing, that's what sociality is. And his example for this is if I say to you, pass the salt, you don't try and monetize that transaction, to use neoliberal terminology. In other words, you don't say, and what do I get from that? Or how much would it cost for me to do that? You just do, you pass me the salt, right? And so I gave this example in a seminar in Pretoria, which is one of the formerly apartheid universities that's now somewhat decolonized. And afterwards, an African student came up to me and said, you know that example you gave? Can I tell you something? In the cafeteria in Pretoria now, they started to charge for salt. You know those little packets that you get? Like a penny or something. And obviously, if you're a white South African, you pay a penny for salt, it's no big deal. If you're an African student and you're basically clinging on by your fingernails to pay the fees at a place like that, literally every penny counts, right? And the distinction of a South African university to the American model is if you haven't paid all of your fees by the start of a given semester, you can't stay in classes. Again, disciplinary methodology, right? Debt is a discipline too, as some of us have found out over the years, but this is a different, very tight form of ring fencing. So it speaks to not just, the archive is not just the document, it's not, right? I mean, it's a multiplicity of things.
Nick.
Richard, sorry.
So, yeah, thanks for this. I really, obviously, enjoyed it, and question I was going to ask picks up a little on your response about the internet.
Yeah, I figured, yeah.
Question, but I want to go back historically. I mean, I like the way you always trace this relation between, let's say, forms of mediation, different forms of art, and different sort of social political formations, in this case, racialized colonialism. But when you talk about this, when we think about, and you were arguing about what's sort of really new, we're at another new sort of conjuncture, new moment. And one of the features of that, or among the features of that, is the kind of intensification of these feelings, the proliferation of these forms of mediation, I mean, with the internet and so on, in a way that is really, the power is kind of scary. I mean, when those monuments were up, it's not to say there wasn't white supremacy in those days too, obviously there was, but it wasn't as visible, it wasn't expressed. I mean, the way people are expressing things now. So I guess one of my questions is about to what extent the technologies of mediation today are instrumental in the form that racism takes today in terms of its intensity, its sort of viral spreading, the memeing and so forth. Tara McPherson was here for our 50th anniversary and was talking about that in relation to these white supremacists, 8chan, et cetera, Reddit sites. And just to tie into that, based on what you were saying in the last, you answered the last question, is the thing about the moment you were describing when the internet was the Wild West, or the sense of freedom, the declaration of the independence of cyberspace and so forth, when people felt that the internet provided this liberation from the forms of state power and capital and so forth, there's a way in which that liberation now is on the right. I mean, that they're, and so there might be a problem with this structure of, this sort of total antinomy between state power and liberation of technology or something. I don't know.
Yeah, all of that. I essentially agree with all of that, except I want to say that in affiliation with your question a moment ago, the white supremacy in its, from the act of ordering and governing Negroes and Indians to the colonial materials was extremely explicit and very direct about visible, brutal, violent hierarchy. So I mean, you know, at the level of absolute of violence and enslavement, I don't think we can say that the preceding, you know, the 400 years of colonial enslavement were not
Yeah, no,
pretty dramatic.
what I was saying is there's not the circulation of the representations and the images.
Yes and no, again, you know, I mean, I think.
Happens in a different way, I
Different
guess.
ways. So you take that print I showed you, Toussaint, right? Those do circulate around the Atlantic world. And one of the things that enslavers were extremely keen to make sure they didn't. So there's a man called Juan Aponte who was executed in Cuba in 1810 for having a print of Toussaint, and there's been a series of interesting studies about him recently, and an exhibition of his history in New York. And so what I think we want to say, obviously the internet provides this astonishing dissemination. We have half the world with access to it now. Now that is different, and I think in some sense that scale does matter, but print culture did some of that, and achieved that level. So a book like Duterte's plantation manual that I showed the images from here was found on pretty much every plantation around the Atlantic world, but there's a difference of scale. And there's a difference of speed. And there's a difference of a sudden invisibility that something like HN or Reddit and these other sites that, you know, the average web user probably isn't going to, that provides for exactly, and I think your term is, the Deleuzian term intensification is exactly the right one. That there's a sense that the pace of it and the potentiality of it is what's forming this planetary formation now. But Winter and others, and Fanon, would argue that monohumanism was also a planetary formation. And so finally then, there's, you know, the platform is agnostic. I mean, it can be used by different formations in different ways. So, you know, if we did refer to the internet in the 90s as the Wild West, you know, bad on us, right? I mean, that's a colonizing metaphor that we should never have used. And maybe that sets us up for the fall that we've just undergone. But by the same token, WhatsApp was instrumental in Roseman's fall. Twitter was instrumental in Black Lives Matter, hashtag Black Lives Matter. Facebook was significant in the Tahrir Square activity. Social media was vital to Occupy Wall Street, and so on. So, yeah, at the moment, the alt-right are running the web. And it's always easier to go with the grain of power than it is to go against the grain of power. And I think that's what we're seeing, is that there's a facilitation that's there because it goes. But at the same time, the connection between a company like Oracle, who organized the dactylology database and these long eugenic histories, that does provide for an intensification in the way that, you know, a Bertillonist system of the 19th century, somebody might have your fingerprints somewhere, but to have access across the 28 or 27 now European Union states immediately does obviously provide for a kind of intensification. So, you know, we can tilt this two ways. We can say that that intensification leads to the likelihood of an accelerating reaction, which is certainly one of the things we're seeing. But I also think, you know, as with any machine, the faster you run it, the more likely it is to break. So there is also this possibility that's contained within that of fracturing. And so when you look at Brexit, whatever it is, it's a machine that's palpably out of control. And so at one level, one of the things I think that's happening is a very long process through which the demos of democracy, it's entirely unclear who that is now. And Parliament was given 8 chances to vote on Brexit, and they said no to all of them, which is a kind of perfectly anarchist thing to do, right? The refusal to accede to power in any form. And yet these are the people who are supposedly the representatives. So the representatives refuse to represent. That's an interesting moment. It's a moment in which, potentially, obviously, what's likely to come out of that is a moment of reaction. The last thing you want to do, frankly, in that situation is to call for a fucking referendum. This is the stupidest idea, to sort of go back, to loop back to this model of the plebiscite. And what it seems to be calling out for is initiatives, but I don't think it'll be a centralized one. It'll have to be a decentralized one. And what's likely then to happen, I would hope, is the breakup of something like, the UK. Because the one person that seems to have any coherence in understanding this is Nicola Sturgeon, who's the First Minister of Scotland. So that would be a 300-year history of the forced link of Scotland to the UK that will begin the process of decoloniality that might go somewhere. So it's a slightly long, rambling answer to your thing, but I think it could go either way, essentially, is what I'm saying.
Thanks. Maybe we can continue this upstairs.
That sounds about right.
Some refreshments. Thanks a lot, Nick.